Welcome back. We are Netherbolt, and in this chapter, we will be grabbing objects with the XR interactions and interactables. In the last video, we swapped the controller model from a sphere to a simple controller. We also talked about how the input action system works and created one as an example. And lastly, we checked out the XR interaction debugger to see what values of our inputs are being tracked when we test it out in our scene. In this chapter, we'll be making the XR Direct Interactor work with our controllers and explore what we can use of it, as well as the XR Grab Interactable. Now, the first thing we need to do is to add the components needed for this chapter. The first component that we'll be adding is the XR Direct Interactor. But to use this, we need something that will act as a trigger, and we will need a Sphere Collider component. And we need to act this as a trigger by checking the isTrigger box. Now let's put back the controller model temporarily so we can have a guide on how big the Sphere Collider should be. Now let's just edit the radius to something smaller so that it fits our controller model. And after that, we can now delete the controller model. Before we get into grabbing things, first let's look into the XR Direct Interactor component. We have the Interaction Manager, which handles all of the interaction between the interactor, which is the controller, and the interactable objects. So make sure we have the XR Interaction Manager inside this before we move on. We also have an interaction layer mask. If we want our controllers to interact with only one thing, for example, a UI, we can do this by adding a layer mask. The attach transform is where objects will be attached when we grab objects. If we just leave it to none, it will default to the transform of the XR Direct Interactor. The select action trigger determines how our select starts. We have state, state change by default, toggle, and sticky. We also have hide controller on select, which is pretty self-explanatory. And if we want an object to be already in our hands when we hit play, we can do this with the starting selected interactable and adding the game object of what we want to put it in. We also have the interactor filters if we want to extend the interactor without needing to create the derived behavior. Then, the events, which are the audio, haptic, and interactor events. In order for us to grab things, we need the XR Grab Interactable component on the objects we want to grab onto. Let us first create a simple table so we can put our objects on top of it. Now, let's add objects that we want to grab onto. For this example, we have a cylinder, a sphere, and also a cube. We have three objects here that we will be adding an XR grab interactable component. Now let's look into the XR grab interactable component. When we add the grab interactable component, it adds a rigid body alongside it, because without it, the XR grab interactable won't work. We might also need to make the collision detection to continuous dynamic, so our objects won't go through the ground when we throw it. In this component, we have the interaction manager, so let's make sure that we put the interaction manager script inside it. We also have the interaction layer mask, so we can choose to separate each interactable. Then we have different select mode, where we can choose if we want only to select the interactable with a single or multiple interactor. The gaze configuration is for those who have access to eye tracking devices, which I don't have, so we won't be using this. We also have different movement types, which we will talk about later with the three objects that we created. We can also choose if we want to track the position of the object and follow where the interactor is. There is also an option to smoothen the movement. We also have an option to track and smoothen the rotation and the scale of an object if you want to. There are also a lot of options when it comes to throwing the object. We also have an attach transform inside the grab interactable, so we can determine where the interactable will be attached once it is grabbed. The dynamic touch is a unique function because it lets us grab an object anywhere from its position, as long as it's inside the sphere collider. We also have different interactable filters and events for when we want to add to the object we are interacting with. Let's go back to the three movement type. We have instantaneous, velocity tracking, and kinematic, each of them having different and unique characteristics. Now let's head in the play mode and test it out. We have here the three movement types in each object. The one I am currently holding right now is the kinematic movement type, which is similar to instantaneous but with a sort of sway when moving it around. Like instantaneous, it can phase through objects when we are grabbing it. Here we have the velocity tracking, which have the sway effect and also a rigid body effect that lets it collide with other objects. Then we have the instantaneous, which follows the controller instantly without the sway effect. This is because it disables the rigid body component to it, which makes it phase through objects. Now, let's see how the attach transform function works. The first thing we need to do is create an empty game object child that will act as the attach point of the object. Let's name it attach point so it can easily be managed. After that, just drag the attach point object to the attach transform. We can then move the attach point to where we want the controller to attach it to. Now, you can see that when we grab the object, We are now grabbing it where the attach point is currently on the cylinder. We also have the option to use the dynamic attach where we can grab the object anywhere. Let's check the box and see how this works. As you can see, when we grab the object, we can grab it anywhere without snapping it to the attach point.